Today we're going to continue in our Old Testament series with the Gospel Project in the book of Esther. I have the task of teaching the entire book in about 50 minutes, so that would be awesome. But beginning next week, which is also next month, James and Eric are going to begin a new series, and so we're going to divert from the Gospel Project curriculum for a while. How long? A month? Till 2 months? And what they're going to do is work through a series on evangelism, approach to evangelism, working off a book by Greg Koukl called Tactics. And so they're going to work us through some strategies, techniques for defending the gospel, sharing the gospel in a biblical and gracious way, but in a way that challenges the presuppositions and the worldview implications of non-believers or people with views that are different than a biblical worldview. So it's going to be super interesting and hopefully very helpful. I'm sure it'll be really helpful for us in our endeavors to share the gospel with others, give us some techniques and whatnot. But like I said, today we are going to work through the book of Esther and how God rescues his people. All right, let me open up in a word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Gracious God, it is a privilege this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to gather and read your word. Thank you for the book of Esther. It challenges us in so many ways, even in our understanding of it, and creates all sorts of tension. And so, Lord, help us as we think about it. Guide us through it, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so putting Esther in context with the previous lessons, we will work through Ezra and Nehemiah. And so in history, that places us in a post-exilic era, right? So Israel and Judah have been carried off into captivity. Judah in particular, 586 BC, conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And they carted off, if they didn't kill them, they carted off the Israelites to Babylon. God said this was coming because of Israel's disobedience, and through the prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, has said that this exile was going to last 70 years, and then a remnant would return. And that's what Ezra and Nehemiah is all about. The exile is officially over, and so a remnant of Israelites, Jews, return, and they begin to build a temple. It started under Ezra, finished it under Nehemiah. Not without difficulty, but they do get the job done. But not every Jew left Babylon, well, by this time I guess it's the Persian Empire, to return to Israel. Some stayed, quite a lot of them stayed. And in a lot of ways, they did what they were told to do in that they established themselves in Babylon under captivity. They lived life. They pursued the benefit of the society around them. They got married. They had children, and that was life. And so, for a lot of Jews, that became the life they lived in Babylon. And Esther is a interesting story. And Esther takes us into the story of the lives of two people in particular, a guy named Mordecai and his niece Esther. And it's a story about God's sovereignty and how he preserves and protects his people in the face of extermination. elimination. And so there's a lot of interesting components about the book of Esther. But if we were going to boil it all down into one key concept, we would say that the book of Esther mainly teaches that God rescues his people even in the face of imminent destruction. And so let's begin with a case study. Let's think about a government edict or a law that's passed, all right? And the law has declared that churches must submit all their sermon manuscripts. The pastors need to submit their manuscripts to the state for approval before they are able to preach them. Okay? If you fail to comply, that could lead to heavy fines, imprisonment, maybe the closure of the church. Okay? So, as a church, we got to decide what to do. Okay? What do we do? What do we do in this situation? Well, in Esther, you see three different things take place when the characters are confronted by edicts and laws and different things like that. Number one, they conceal. So if you were to read Esther 2, 10, and 11, you would find that Mordecai instructs Esther to conceal her identity as a Jew. And she does not let the governing authorities, and in particular the king, King Ahasuerus, doesn't let him know that she's a Jew until the time is right. Sometimes you defy. That's the second option there. Okay, so in chapter 3, Esther was not supposed to approach the king without being summoned, and she takes a risk, goes out and does it. Defies that standing order that no one approaches the king unless he requests on pain of death. Okay? And then other times she submits. And so in chapter 7, when you read that there, she tells the king about her situation and what's going on there, and she asks him to act and then waits for him to answer. Okay? So let me just give you a big picture, high level, 30,000 feet view of the book of Esther so that we can figure out how she conceals, defies, and submits, and then we'll come back to our question, our case study that we were dealing with. Okay? All right, so Mordecai and Esther are Jews in Babylon, in Susa, which is Persia by this time. If I say Babylon, I mean Persia. Okay, they're in Persia this time. At this time, they've been there. Esther's family has been there for about 100 years, and they have pretty much assimilated into the society. Mordecai is part of the administration there, the king's administration, and he about the king being assassinated. So he uncovers it and he reports it. He actually saves the life of the king, and his name is written down in the book there and whatnot. The story opens with like a part, like the king Ahasuerus has a banquet and he's pretty drunk, and he decides that it's a good idea to have his wife come out and show off her beauty to all of his friends. Okay, husbands, what a great idea, right? Maybe not. And Vashti actually refuses. She's like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to go dance in front of your drunk friends. How demeaning. She's got a point. And the king doesn't take that very well, and his administration doesn't either, because, man, the administration thinks that if everyone sees that the king's wife disobeys him, then wives everywhere are going to rebel, and there's just going to be chaos in the kingdom. So we need to make this proclamation that all wives everywhere must submit to their husbands. Great job. Good idea. All right, and as a result, of all of this, Vashti gets banished. Right? kicked out, no longer the queen. King can't be without a queen, and so his advisors has this brilliant idea that they're just going to gather all the beautiful women from the region or from the country and have a beauty contest, and which is probably not just a beauty contest. They're going to have a contest anyway to see who pleases the king the most, and that person's going to become the queen. Well, Esther wins, and that puts her in a position to have some influence over the king. Throughout all of this time, there is a guy named Haman. He's an Agagite. And that's important because we know that if you trace Haman's history back, an Agagite is an Amalekite, okay? And King Saul, when he was conquering the Promised Land, was commanded by God to destroy all of the Amalekites. They were pagan, awful, evil people. He was to destroy all of them with their herds and everything. But Saul didn't do that. Remember, he left King Agag alive. He didn't kill them all. Samuel ended up killing King Agag. But because he didn't do that, now this is going to come back to haunt the Jews, because several generations later, this descendant of King Agag is now in a position to exterminate all the Jews. He hates Mordecai, he hates Jews, and he wants them all killed, and so he convinces the king to make a proclamation that all Jews on a specific day are going to be destroyed, exterminated. But Esther's a Jew, and so that's a problem. And so her and Mordecai get together, they make a plan, and then Esther goes in before the king and throws a bunch of banquets for him, gets him nice and softened up, makes her request. And when the king finds out that this proclamation is going to mean the end of his wife and her people, he's like, who made that proclamation anyway? And he's like, Haman did. And so then the king's wrath turns against Haman. Haman actually gets hung on the gallows that he made for Mordecai in order to kill him. So you have this massive reversal of fortune. Okay? So throughout that story, and they lived happily ever after. Throughout that story, you've got a concealment of identity, you've got a defying of standing orders as far as approaching the king, and you've got Esther then submitting to his wishes once she made the request. Okay? So let's go back to our case study, right? You got this new law. Churches have to submit all of their sermon manuscripts before approval, or for approval before they're preached, and there are consequences if we don't. So what do? How do we respond? Conceal, defy, or submit? What do you think? Just remember, your decision might put me in jail, so do you want me to go to jail? Thank you. That's my son. Awesome. All right. Love you too, buddy. Kevin? Okay? Defy. Pay the fine. Send your pastor to prison. Who cares about him? Right? Jareen. Okay, so you would say maybe conceal in that way. Like the church conceals itself, it goes underground. Okay? I don't go to prison necessarily in that case. I like that. What else? What should we do? Okay. James. Everybody's head is bobbing. Yeah. I don't know. There's too many variables, right? Yeah. Yeah. Those are all good answers. Like when you think about concealment, I could submit a vanilla outline or a vanilla manuscript, and then when I actually preach the sermon, you would add in the things that I might be objectionable to whatever governing authority is. So I would give them enough to satisfy them, but conceal the entire thing. We could defy. I mean, that's part of defiance too. Maybe part of the question is how are they going to follow up, right? Are you a plant? Are there plants, governmental plants in here? Are any of you spying on me to see what I'm actually going to say? Okay, so the government has surveillance, and they've got AI that is scanning all the words that I say, and then flagging stuff that comes across as violating whatever it is. Okay, so we would have to consider all of those things, the technology, and figure out what we would do. But in the end, we've got a command to preach the gospel, and so that. In that situation, however we work through those, using a combination of all three of those things, our fidelity is to God and to God first, and so we would have to work that way. That's just a fun case study to think about. What might we do in that sort of situation? The right answer would really depend on all of the variables when as considered. Probably the closest thing that we've ever come to something like this is how we were going to operate during COVID when they had all the lockdowns and the restrictions and everything going on there. That was an interesting time to navigate what the government mandates were and how we were going to operate as a church. What is our responsibility before God? What's our responsibility to the government? How those two things are clashing. Where, if they are clashing, and then how do we navigate that? That was such a weird thing because we would hear something, or like the governor would put out a mandate of some sort, and then I would go to work. This is when Pastor Werner and I were, Pastor Werner was still here, and I would go to work drafting a strategy for how we were going to do this. And that afternoon, new mandates would come out, and so I'm like, delete, start over again. All right, how are we going to navigate all of this? And so it was such a fluid situation, and things were changing almost daily, sometimes hourly, and just trying to work through all of that. That was pretty interesting. And I probably won't say if we concealed, defied, or submitted, because maybe we did all of that. I don't know. All right. I gave you a big overview, or a high-level overview of the book of Esther, but let me talk about some themes. There's a lot of banquets in Esther, such that it becomes a theme, and it becomes such a theme in that a lot of the plot line, the storyline revolves around all of these banquets. I think if you were to count them all, I think there's something like 10 different banquets that are listed in this book. And when you read that, you're like, well, there's only like what, 9 or 10 chapters in Esther? They're like partying all the time here. What's going on? But we have to remember there's probably something like 10 years of time that has elapsed through that the book of Esther covers. And so maybe they were partying once a year. I don't know. But the Persian Empire was known for its parties, and so they like to do this sort of thing. And so major events, major happenings in the Persian Empire and in regard or relation to the Jewish lineage, history, and all of that takes place surrounding these banquets. It's a banquet where Queen Vashti gets kicked out. Because of that banquet, Esther moves into the queenship, queenhood, whatever. She's a queen. And then she throws a bunch of banquets to kind of work her little magic there and influence the king and protect her people. So banquets are a pretty big theme here. A lot of humor in this book. Sometimes, we are rightly reverent toward the scripture, and are kind of hesitant to laugh at some of the things that happen, and maybe that's a good approach. But there's quite a bit of humor in this book. Like I mentioned, the edict that Ahasuerus' satraps put out about all the women in the kingdom are just going to rebel because Vashti did a crazy thing, and we need to say that all women need to obey their husbands. What a crazy thing to do, right? As if you can legislate that sort of thing anyway. So just funny things like that. Ahasuerus comes off as kind of like a very easily manipulated, almost like a bumbling idiot. He doesn't know what he's doing half the time, and he's influenced by all sorts of people into making dumb decisions and then having to backtrack and fix those decisions. One of the funnier things that about Ahasuerus is in chapter 6, you remember the story goes that he couldn't sleep one night. And so what do you do when you can't sleep, right? Sometimes people will read something to put themselves to sleep. What does he read? Do you remember? What does King Ahasuerus read? Of his own kingdom. So let me read something really boring so I can go to sleep. Let me read about myself. That'd be like, I'm borrowing this from a commentary, but that would be like me reading my own sermons because I can't sleep at night to put myself to sleep. It's just super funny, super funny. So he's reading about his own reign, his own rule, and because he can't sleep. That's when he actually finds out that, hey, this guy Mordecai saved my life. What did we do for him? I don't remember rewarding him. And then that as we'll talk about in a second, is a actually huge transition point in the book. One of the major themes of the book of Esther is what we call undercover sovereignty. Okay, what do I mean by undercover sovereignty? exactly right. Isn't that crazy? You have a book of the Bible that doesn't mention God once. Not by the name Yahweh, and not even by any of the more general terms like El or Adonai or anything like that. Okay? Not mentioned at all. And so when you read the book of Esther, it's in some ways a work of literary genius in that it's written in such a way that you can't help but see God's sovereignty throughout the narrative and the storyline and all of the things that happen. So even though God is never mentioned, it screams that Yahweh is in control. The God of the Jews is in control of this entire situation. The heart of the king is like water in the hands of the Lord, the psalmist says. Now, let's ask this question. Why? Why might the Lord never be mentioned in Esther? James? Okay. That's an interesting thought. I don't know that I would have thought of that. Any thoughts? Mark? In that way, Esther might resonate with us more than any other book in the Bible, because every other one, all other 65 books, either have God appearing, speaking to someone or through someone, that either the writer or the characters that are being written about, or it's written by an apostle who had direct revelation from the person of Jesus Christ himself. Esther is the only book where you don't know who wrote it, and God is never mentioned in there, and so that, we can connect with that because, we have the words of God here in the Bible, but God is not appearing to us with divine revelation, special revelation. There are no legitimate prophets out there that are speaking truth in revelatory ways at this time. And so our sense of God is what he has explained in Scripture. We know him there. We have plenty of evidence to put our faith and trust in him and have complete confidence in the Word of God. But from our perspective, God in ways that we can't necessarily see and understand. Okay, so that's super helpful. Why else? All right. My reason might be slightly controversial. Ooh. What's he going to say? I don't think that Mordecai and Esther are held up as examples of godly people. And one of the reasons why God is not mentioned in this book is because he is distancing himself from those two people and showing that he can work despite their actions. Okay? Controversial, right? A lot of times Esther is held up as a woman of faith, and Mordecai is held up as a man of faith. But actually, there's no evidence in the book at all that their faith is in Yahweh and that they're trusting him. Now, Esther, when she develops her plan, to save the Jews. She calls on Mordecai and his men to fast for 3 days. And she's going to do the same with her attendants. But what is usually associated with fasting? Prayer. No mention of prayer. And so what is the fast? What is the purpose of the fasting? It's pretty unclear. It's all nebulous. It's all shrouded in clouds, and it's all murky. And so this book, I think, shows us that God is sovereign over the actions of people despite or in spite of their fidelity or lack thereof to him. Okay, the Lord is sovereign despite man's actions. Okay, and so you've got all of these questions. And this book creates all sorts of tension when you read it. All right, was it right for Esther to enter into the king's harem? Was it right? Man, when you read that beauty pageant is a little bit more risque than a beauty pageant. Okay. Going into the king has a lot more insinuation than just a beauty pageant. Okay, and so, man, this is super interesting, very tense. Like, is this moral? Is this right? And actually, I'm not sure that it is. You say, well, the king conscripted her into the harem. She didn't have a choice. Yeah, well, sometimes people are forced to do things against God's morality, and they stand up for that, and they're willing to pay whatever consequence that is. Let me give you another controversial take, okay? And it ties into what is happening here. A lot of people think that the book of Song of Solomon is written by Solomon. It's true. But they think that it is Solomon's love story with the Shunammite woman, and that was his first wife. And, that poem was written in relation to his first wife. But I actually think that there are two men at stake in the book of Song of Solomon, and the woman, the Shunammite woman, is having to make the decision of whether or not she's going to enter into Solomon's harem and enjoy all the luxury and all of that, or if she's going to choose the shepherd boy whom she truly loves, and there's a relationship between those two. And so the book of Song of Solomon is about Solomon trying to entice her by flattering her and telling her about her beauty and bringing her into the harem. And she's got to make the choice of whether or not she's going to do that, or if she's going to choose fidelity and faithful love in a relationship with this shepherd boy. And she ends up actually choosing to not go into Solomon's harem and choosing the shepherd boy. And so in that case, if my hot take, whatever you want to call it, on the book of Song of Solomon is correct, then there is an option to not enter into the king's harem. And so Esther has a choice. But it seems like she goes along with the culture and cultural expectations. She has assimilated herself into the immoral practices of that day. Again, I think those same practices existed in Israel too, so we're not exonerating them there. But she follows the culture in that way and does so in, I think, an immoral way. She had the choice not to. Yes, I'm sure you do. Yeah. Yeah. Sister, the whole sister thing, yeah. Yep. Absolutely. It's the same kind of immoral, faithless action. Abraham gets the credit for that faithless action because he set her up for that. Like, I think that what Abraham was doing was all right, let's say you're my sister. That way they won't kill me, when they find out that you're my wife and they see it. So as your brother, anyone that pursues you, like for a relationship, they'll have to negotiate with me as far as the dowry and stuff is concerned, and then we can deal with that situation as it comes. What Abraham did not anticipate was that Pharaoh would just grab her and say, she's mine now. And so his whole plan blew up at that point. So faith would have said, no, she's my wife, just despite what the circumstances were. Sarah is very much, I think, in that way, unable to control her own destiny in that way. Where I think the Shunammite woman in Song of Solomon and Esther here has the opportunity to decide what they want to do. Yes. So that is Esther 4:14. And Mordecai says this: if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. All right, maybe a little credit to Mordecai for having some faith that God is going to deliver no matter what. But you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So it's shrouded in a little bit of doubt and mystery. So he's saying, hey, you could be there. Perhaps you're there for such a time as this. Now, in God's sovereignty, yes, she is there. She's placed in that situation to be a catalyst for deliverance for her people. But this is where I think God is sovereignty despite human actions. Okay? God will bring about his good purposes even if people do wrong and don't follow his will. Okay. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Like Joseph's brothers. Like Acts chapter 4, where God preordained that Christ would be crucified. And yet the Jews and Herod are responsible. They did what God wanted them to do in crucifying the Son of God. Okay? God is sovereign over evil. And he's not responsible for it, but he does use it. He brings out his good purposes from it. There it is. Was she there for such a time as this? Well, yeah. But that's because God's sovereign. Right? God's sovereign over the poor decisions that we make. Okay? And again, there's no evidence that Mordecai or Esther possessed any sort of saving faith. Okay? And that comes to us because God's not even mentioned there. Okay? You can't express saving faith without calling upon the name of the Lord. This book also tells us that the Lord has power to reverse evil plans. And this is where the Bible is fascinating just on its face, like when we read a story like this. But there are so many things that are woven into it that you might not pick up on otherwise. And one of the literary devices that Hebrew writers used a lot was something called a chiastic structure. Okay? A chiastic structure is where the writer in his storytelling or his descriptions or whatever will make a series of statements that lead to a point, and then he will parallel those statements and he'll come back to where he began. Okay? So, you see this in the Psalms all of the time, where you have a point, like a main idea that it's driving at, and then a parallel point, and a parallel point, and you come back to the beginning. The book of Esther is structured just like that. Okay? And so on the top half, you've got all of the events that happen negatively toward the Jews, okay, mostly led by Haman. okay? And so you've got Esther coming into, the party, you got Esther coming into the harem, and then Mordecai doing his thing, and then Haman being upset because, Mordecai didn't bow to him when he went by, and so then this plot to kill all of the Jews. Okay, so you've got these points in the story. It comes to a focal point in chapter 6 when Ahasuerus can't sleep, and he opens up the book, and he reads about Mordecai saving his life. And so then, from that point on, then the story reverses. All of the plans that Haman makes, up to the point where, Ahasuerus has a sleepless night, are then undone one by one in the reverse order until you get back to the place where the Jews are saved and, the kingdom is at a place of peace again. And so it's just the mere structure of the book itself tells us that the Lord has the ability to reverse the plans of evil. That's the way the book is actually written. It's this plan of Haman, and then it gets completely reversed. And that's just a testimony of God's power. How do we know the wise and godly response when we face persecution? How can we know the wise and godly response when we face persecution? What do you think? Do you have steps that you go through, things that you think about? Not a lot of us face persecution like on this level, but we all face some at some point. How do we deal? How do we deal with that? Share. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Oh, all right, good. Relevant scriptures that apply to that particular instance. Okay, so we got the scriptures. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Romans 8:28, 29. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Yep, that faith in that promise. Larry? Yep. Yeah, those covenant promises will not go unmet. Yeah. But again, that's not a reason to be presumptuous and to take advantage of those things. Yeah, Karen. Mm. Yeah. Right on. Yeah. Walking in the Spirit. Walking in the Spirit. Good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. add one more thing to that. I don't think any one of us possesses all the wisdom of God. I mean, we have the scriptures, we have the ability to read and study and understand those things. But sometimes when we are in a circumstance and the pressures are bearing down on us, our judgment might be clouded, our ability to think through things, you might be harmed, our perspectives, might not be exactly accurate. And I think that one of the ways that we can respond wisely and godly in the face of persecution is by engaging with our church family and using our brothers and sisters in Christ to help us understand our situation and what that response might be. What might be the wise thing to do in this sort of situation, especially if you're not sure. And this is where, as a church body, we help one another out in these situations, because there's a lot of wise people in this church, a lot of people with a lot of life experience that have seen a lot of things. And so eliciting their help in those situations, help us answer that question. How do we know? How do we know that God rescues and preserves his people, or how does that shape our decision? How does knowing that God rescues, how does knowing that, I have to interpret my own questions here. How does knowing that God rescues and preserves his people shape our decisions? What we don't want it to do is like what Larry was talking about, is presume upon those covenant promises where we just decide to do whatever we want because we know that God, is in covenant with us already. He's made promises, and so we presume upon those promises. That's not what we want to do. But how does knowing that God rescues and preserves his people shape our decisions? Mark. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's another thing that I think leads us to believe that Ezra and Mordecai are not cast in the most gracious light here. Because if you read the Hebrew Bible, Esther is embedded next to Daniel. Okay? What did Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do when they were in a situation where they were forced to comply, or under compulsion to comply with the culture? Right? They didn't go along with it. Right? They maintained fidelity to the Lord and were blessed for it. Okay, so in the Hebrew Bible, that stands as a little bit of a contrast here. This is probably the right thing that you do in captivity, under persecution, how you are in the world, not of it. And this is how you don't do it, or shouldn't. I think we get back to that theme of God's sovereignty and his providence in the book of Esther. And when we are reliant on God's promises, we have full confidence and faith and trust in him, and that he is doing all things he's working all things out for his good. He is providentially bringing about all of his good purposes and plans. And that is, knowing that and having confidence in that is what brings us peace in the midst of whatever trial or temptation, persecution that we might be under. Providence brings peace in everything that we do. We have a God that's in control and is completely trustworthy, and we can rest in that. Any final questions? Any thoughts?